Hello and welcome to Design North East. I'm Tony Wyatt and I'm going to introduce you to the National Design Guide and its purpose. Places affect us all. They are where we live, work and spend our leisure time. Well-designed places influence the quality of our experience as we spend time in them and move around them. This design guide, the National Design Guide, illustrates how well-designed places that are beautiful, enduring and successful can be achieved in practice. This is the second part of a 7-part learning program to help you understand and apply the principles in the National Design Guide in your work. The material was developed on behalf of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government and was going to be delivered at learning events for councillors and officers of local authorities throughout England. In the North East, we had planned to hold a learning workshop at the Toffee Factory, Newsburn in Newcastle in March 2020, and this would have included a walking seminar to enable participants to try out the guide on site. In the light, however, of the new normal as a result of COVID-19, we have also developed the material into a number of linked online learning sessions. And this is the first of 3 sessions which are going to introduce the 10 characteristics of well-designed places. Overall, the objectives of this learning program are to understand how the design guide relates to national planning policy as well as local planning policy and practice, and in particular to become familiar with the 10 characteristics of the guide and their mutual interconnections, to also be able to make practical use of the National Design Guide to evaluate design quality, and also understand how this guide relates to the tools and processes that you can use to secure good design. The 7 parts of this learning program are set out there. This is part 2, focusing on the 10 characteristics of a well-designed place, and in particular context, identity and built form. As we've previously talked about, the 10 characteristics of well-designed places are at the heart of the guide. It should be said that they represent outcomes, things that we expect to see in a place that works for people, a place that is successful. The guide does not talk too much about how you get those outcomes, although we will explore that further. First characteristic that the guide looks at is context, and in very much about summing up what makes for a positive response to context. And you can see there listed that's based on a sound understanding of the features of the site and its surrounding context, using baseline studies as a starting point for any subsequent design. These well-designed places are going to be integrated into their surroundings so they relate well to them. They are influenced by and influence their context positively and are responsive to local history, culture and heritage. It's important to say that this is a two-way street. It is about what the new development takes from its context and also what it's going to give back. And there's particular emphasis within the design guide about the importance of baseline studies which illustrates that good design always starts with a good process. More of that later. Throughout the guide there are exemplar illustrations and explanations of their relevance. So in this case you can see in the photograph on the right an illustration of a place where the topography, landscape character, cultural history and built form all define the context for Ilkley in West Yorkshire. For each of the characteristics there will be 2 or 3 sections with the heading like this, which explains an outcome we expect of a well-designed place or development. So in this case, understanding and relating well to the site, its local and wider context. And the guide goes on to provide a list of the things to be considered when we're examining whether a new development has responded to its context. We have highlighted a few of these on this slide just to show the range. So for example, it's not just about materials and the details of buildings, it's also large-scale things like the landscape and topography, practical issues such as access and movement, and non-physical things like activities and demographics. This illustration from the guide shows the process of identifying the existing features of a site and the wider area to help inform a new development. And this is precisely the sort of analysis we need to see in planning applications and also in pre-application material. At design review here in the North East, design find frequently that we're frustrated by seeing plans that simply don't go beyond the red line, and we will often be asked in for a wider movement diagram, for example, that shows how children will walk to school, how people will get to the shops, etc. Second section under context, about valuing heritage, local history and culture. And there are a range of responses that can be made, and to illustrate this in the guide, 2 examples. On the left, Scheme in Frome in Somerset is a development that very closely reflects the historic buildings around it. So you can see that the new homes relate positively to their historic town centre, and the proportions of buildings, their openings and their materials all complement and enhance the context. On the right is Timekeepers Square in Salford, which is clearly contemporary in style but no less respectful of the local history, heritage and culture of this part of Salford. Historic streets are reintroduced to create permeable and well-sized urban blocks, and the new housing creates a very positive setting for several listed buildings, notably Salford Cathedral. In other situations, it may be legitimate to design something that clearly contrasts with its historic setting, so as not to dilute its very qualities. So does that mean that anything goes when it comes to responding to context? Although the design guide is largely about outcomes, so what good actually looks like, it is important to understand that design is a process. And here we see on the slide, the list on the left explains the stages in the design process, which can be often boiled down to the 3 on the right. So a good design process leads to good outcomes, and the choices that have been made as to how to respond to context need to be the result of a thorough survey of the site and its context. And the guide, as I mentioned before, emphasises the importance of baseline studies, which could be studies produced by the designers, or in addition, existing documents such as county-wide landscape appraisals or conservation area management plans. Having done this, there should be a thorough analysis of all that survey material, and that should include an options appraisal. The emphasis here is on the plural. There should be several options tested. And then the choices you have made for your preferred option should be seen through convincingly to provide your detailed plan. You can see from this excerpt, particularly in the first bullet point regarding identity, that the guide is asking a lot from this characteristic. So a positive identity for a place is often what attracts people to a place and persuades them to stay and binds them together as a community. The second bullet point talks about character, a character that suits the context. So it's not just its history, but also how we live today and going forward into the future. And the third bullet point, visually attractive, can be difficult because what we personally find attractive is, of course, to some extent subjective. But we have to go beyond what we personally find attractive and think much more about what will attract people. And of course that might be different segments of the population to ourselves in terms of age, social class, background, etc. In the illustration you can see the distinctive character of the buildings and landscape helps to create an identity for this new development. Its design has a strong narrative and clear precedents. And you might recognise this as being Derwentthorpe in York. The first section under identity may sound like we are repeating the content from the previous characteristic of context, but response to context is the biggest source for identity. It reinforces the point that a range of responses are possible, but it is about the quality of how they are carried through. And in the guide there are these three exemplars. On the left you can see some apartments designed in a traditional style in response to the local identity found in this part of Islington in London, with the frontage of the development designed as a series of facades creating a vertical rhythm along the street, which is reinforced by the composition and proportions of the openings. In the middle, by contrast, you can see timber cladding, gable ends, a pedestrian focused public realm and generous planting all give an informal rural character to this new neighbourhood at Abobe in Great Knighton, Cambridge. And on the right you can see that the use of brick cladding on this tall building in Southwark in London, Blackfriars Circus, gives it a character that fits well into its local historic surroundings and a texture that is human scale and tactile where the building meets the ground. This second section brings us back to the more difficult area of what is considered attractive and indeed high quality and well design. And again, just to reinforce, it's important to remember it's not about what we personally find attractive, but what will be attractive to the people it is appealing to. And the first three of these bullet points regarding typical building forms, features, materials, drawing upon architectural precedents prevalent in the local area, and using local building landscape or topographical features, plus materials or planting types. They all suggest an approach to identity that very much draws on the existing context at all scales. But the fourth bullet point is suggesting that there are instances where we want to do something new, and more about that in a moment. But either way, the result should be the final bullet point, somewhere that people can identify with, and that residents and local communities can see a positive and coherent identity. Here you can see how within identity we can aim to create character and identity. And this section reiterates the point that identity is created at a range of levels. And the guide goes on to say that the siting development in the wider landscape, the layout, the pattern of streets, landscape and spaces, the movement network, and the arrangement of blocks, the form, scale, design, materials, and details of buildings and landscape are all key. And there are two examples here. On the left, you can see a neighbourhood in a semi-rural setting which is drawn on local historical precedents to create a distinctive character. It's defined by the height and the massing of the buildings, variation in roof forms, and the material selections. You can see that the gables have been paired to create a focal point and also mark the entrance to a street. And this is a scheme at Tralles Newton in Norfolk. On the right, you can see a wide street with house frontages stepping down along its length. Their simple forms, the considered roof detailing and colourful facades create a strong identity appropriate to the local and wider context of Nans Leddon in Newquay in Cornwall. Section 3 also talks and deals with the question of whether a new development, by implication, is a new place, whereas in the majority of cases it is not. You are wanting to reinforce the identity of the existing place, even where that might have seen some evolution of that identity. In other cases, however, a change of scale in an urban setting or a new garden village in a rural setting may require a new identity. And that could also be the case where the immediate context presently has a poor character. For example, some of our late 20th century suburbia, or on an existing estate regeneration project. This illustration shows a proposal for a new garden village in Surrey on the site of a former airfield. And what's interesting about this is that it is consciously not trying to copy the form of a traditional Surrey village. When we develop at this sort of scale, we often have to then break down identity through the use of different character areas. In this case, a denser, largely car-free core with more traditional petals radiating out from that core, and in the foreground an area of large low-density homes set in woodland. Probably worth mentioning that in this particular case there is still a lot of ongoing debate about the extent to which the character of the airfield and its history is carried through into the identity of the new development. Third characteristic, built form and achieving a coherent pattern of development. And this is very much reinforcing that it's about that pattern of development and the effect on how that will have on where we live. And in particular, well-designed places have compact forms of development that are walkable, contributing positively to well-being and placemaking, accessible to local public transport, services and facilities to ensure sustainable development, having recognisable streets and other spaces with edges defined by buildings, making it easy for anyone to find their way around, and promoting safety and accessibility. And also achieving memorable features or groupings of buildings, spaces, uses or activities that all help create a sense of place, promoting inclusion and cohesion. And the illustration in the guide is a local one. It's the Mailings housing development in the Ouseburn Valley, opposite the toffee factory mentioned earlier. This section talks about the compact form of development, by which it means using land efficiently by building at optimal densities. So what is the highest density we can achieve consistent with other objectives? That the built form brings people together to support local services and facilities. Encouraging walking, particularly for short journeys, and cycling to services nearby. And having street layouts that respond to their context. On the left is a development designed around a clear street hierarchy, having a mix of open spaces and an associated variety of building types and sizes. And this is a scheme at Great Western Park in Didcot in South Oxfordshire. On the right, a network of streets and courts frame open spaces that allow views out to the hillside and coastline for existing and new residents. And the built form adopts a contemporary approach to traditional local typologies. And this is a scheme known as Officers Field in Weymouth in Dorset. This section of the guide is talking about how we should determine built form of new development, and that we need to look at the site, its context and the opportunities they present, the proposed identity and character for the development in the wider place, the lifestyle of occupants and other users, and importantly, resource efficiency, climate change, mitigation and adaptation. And it talks about establishing an appropriate relationship with the pattern, sizes and proportion of existing streets in the local area. And the diagram on the right from the guide illustrates through these figuregrounds how considering the layout, grain and scale of buildings and spaces in different situations and drawing inspiration from existing traditional street patterns helps to create new developments that fit well into the surrounding context, be they suburban, urban, on the edge of a settlement or in the centre. The example on the left is of a higher density urban development which uses the size and location of open spaces, layout, orientation and stepping facades and roofs to break up the overall form. This is a scheme at Bromley by Bow in East London. In contrast, in the middle, the form of these new homes draws from local rural typologies with a contemporary interpretation. And this is a scheme known as Carrowbreck Meadow in Norfolk. The built form section, and particularly subsection 2, talks about recognisable or successful streets, or as we might say, real streets. We all know instinctively what real streets look like, and the guide talks about the relationship between building fronts and backs, with successful streets characterised by buildings facing the street to provide interest, overlooking and rural frontages at ground level. Whether urban or rural, trafficked or pedestrianised, this formula is the same. And you can see a local example from the northeast, Grey Street in Newcastle in the bottom right illustration. The guide introduces this new concept, which it calls destinations, and this is a term which brings together city, town, village, neighbourhood centres, public transport hubs, main squares, important community facilities. And it goes on to say, destination provide opportunities for people to meet, share experiences and come together as a community. By bringing existing and new together, destinations become a place for everyone. And the idea here is that the way these are designed should help to make them more successful by clustering key uses, including high quality public spaces, increasing densities so more people live and work around them, and making doubly sure that these destinations have active edges. And the illustration here is of a proposal for the new centre of a garden village, trying to bring together those features to make it a new destination. We hope that you found this part of the programme useful, and the next part of the learning programme will introduce a further 4 of the 10 characteristics, and we will advise you when it is available. Thank you.